So I haven't changed my location and I haven't dressed any fancier. I did get rid of that glary light above my head that maybe was producing some strange effects. Anyway, so the crucial point running through all our readings this week is simply that race, like gender and sexuality last week, our concept is a concept that seems to be eternal or just eternally present, but it has a history. Its history, though, looks very different from the histories of gender and sexuality. Foucault, for instance, shows how the words homosexuality and a bit later heterosexuality emerge out of the newly invented social sciences in the 1870s. Now, Eve Sedgwick warned us not to take those words too literally. The invention of the word homosexuality is not the invention of homosexuality or heterosexuality. And reading her, it becomes clear that the concepts of homosexuality and heterosexuality and the identities of the homosexual and heterosexual person began to emerge before those words did. And there's been a lot of work, quite frankly, about that slow process of emergence that sounds a lot different from Foucault's the homosexual was invented in 1870 claim, which he never really meant completely literally either. It was meant to be provocative. Anyway, what's clear from the point is that the identity emerges sometime before the word. One thing that's clear from Appia is that the word race existed centuries before the modern concept of race emerged. His example of the usages of race in classical literature, and then his more detailed examples from Shakespeare, are meant to underscore that point. There's not a hint in those earlier usages that race is the biological concept it becomes in the modern era. It might have to do with being an infidel or a believer. It might have to do with more theological notions, even more theological notions of someone's nature or character. But biology just wasn't what identity was based in. It's only in the 19th century, with the growth of race science and social Darwinism, that the modern idea of race comes into being. And this term race science is a really important one. I think it came up in at least two of our readings. I'm always tempted, and there's something right about calling it pseudoscience. But it was the science of the day. It wasn't some marginal kind of thing. It wasn't, say, climate change denial science. It was the science that people believed. In fact, many of, and not just people, but scientists believe. In fact, many of the modern scientific disciplines, including most of what we'd call social sciences, but also physical sciences, were primarily motivated by the attempt to explain race and racial hierarchy. At the origin of nearly every discipline is the idea of race. And that includes literary study, which of course structurally excluded writings by people of color. We know that much, but which also, as we learned back in Literature Week, defined literature by nation and attributed the differences in national literatures to what it called race. That their notions of race were constructed differently from ours. Very few people anyway, talk very much about the Anglo-Saxon race now. Let me start that sentence again. That their notions of race were constructed differently from ours. The Anglo-Saxon race at the origin of English literature was at one point a different race from the Germanic races, though at other points they merged into whiteness. You won't find any early examples of literary study that aren't organized by race. And the crucial thing to understand is that these weren't just surface meanings. I'm not talking about casually racist statements made by literary scholars or writers, or that literary scholars were simply reflecting the racist ideas of their day. Literary scholars, along with scholars in other disciplines, were actively involved in making race, in constructing this fiction, or in what Hosang and LeBennett call racialization. And so, there's examples. As Appia explains in some detail, writers themselves were involved in racialization too. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe is about racial identity, even if the racial terms are Jew, Norman, and Anglo-Saxon. The realization of the racist origins of even the concept of the Anglo-Saxon has recently, I think it was just this summer, resulted in the Society of Anglo-Saxonists changing its name. A realization that their very name was based in race science of the 19th century. Every English department used to require a course in Anglo-Saxon. The discipline of English itself was, and maybe still is, based in this racialized set of ideas. And the same is true of all the early writers of the United States. Our Sir Walter Scott was James Fenimore Cooper, whose works like Last of the Mohicans are very thinly veiled racial allegories. But anyway, I'm not going to review the specifics of Appia's history because I think he's a clear writer. Though, of course, if you have questions, feel free to ask them. And it's probably worth noting that even literary historians and social historians who tell the story of racial thinking in the U.S. And beyond tell that story differently. Within the U.S., some might take as their origin of racial thinking 1619, the year of the arrival of the first slaves in what would become the United States. Others might take as their origin the first time the word white appears in U.S. law. It's in the first immigration law in 1791, I think was the year. I'm not going to swear to that. Or the addition to state constitutions, North and South, in the 1820s onward, of the word white as a specifier of who was entitled to citizenship and rights. Rights were taken away from free blacks in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s. And that was built into, they had constitutional conventions, sometimes just to add the word white to the Constitution, where it had not been before. Others might argue that mass immigration of Irish and Germans in particular in the 1840s first prompted a shift from a kind of English domination to white domination, as those groups were glommed together under the category of white. Less interesting than the particular event or year that these histories choose as their origin points, right? That's always, some historians like to do that, and it's always a bit of a fiction too, is the fact that so many histories, many following Toni Morrison's lead, focus on the racial formation of whiteness. Some of this is doing what critical white studies has long argued for, which is marking the unmarked term. Whiteness most often seems to exist invisibly as a kind of unmarked norm from which other races are seen as just deviations or marked terms. It can be important to identify the social construction of whiteness to show how whiteness is a fiction. And whiteness is primarily a story told by a succession of immigrants to the Americas as a way of marking their difference from indigenous peoples in the Americas and from the people that wealthy European colonizers were enslaving and trading as commodities and objects. As James Baldwin writes, he's been a real inspiration to much of this kind of scholarly work, almost nobody in Europe thought of themselves as white. They were Irish or Swedish or French or Italian or whatever. And the way Baldwin tells the story, as soon as they got off the boat, or at least as soon as they saw that identifying as white got them privileges that identifying with other possibilities did not get them, they started identifying themselves as white. This racialization of white people, of Europeans as white people, one could say, in the 19th century was not a natural or inevitable process. Indeed, scientific racism argued for a while that Irish were an inferior race, closer to the African than to the white race. And there were lots of early Irish immigrants who tried to make alliances along the cause of abolitionism with black anti-slavery activists. And on a day-to-day level in the middle of the 19th century, I'm dwelling on this is my field, right? The poorest neighborhoods in many cities, including here in New York, were mixtures of Irish and free blacks. But the vast majority of European immigrants followed the example set by the masses of Irish immigrants, who not only identified with whiteness in a kind of emotional or psychological way, but also led massive riots against blacks in cities after city, city after city, year after year, culminating in the largest riots in U.S. history before the 1990s, the New York City draft riots, in which Irish mobs slaughtered dozens or maybe even hundreds of black residents of New York. Fordham's connection to those riots via Dagger John would be interesting for someone to research sometime. In other words, these are histories of racialization. Now, this is a newer word, as LeBennett and Hosang indicate. It can help us to distinguish between some things. Race is a fiction, but racialization is a real process. When Irish people are racialized as black, it has very different consequences than if they're racialized as their own separate race or just racialized as white. The racialization of, say, immigrants from Mexico is a different story. Coming from a country where racial mestizaje, or mixing, is the official ideology of the state, as it is in Mexico, but where certain mixes are privileged over others. But then coming to, or in the 1840s, suddenly finding themselves in, after the US invasion, suddenly finding themselves in a country built on distinct separate races, there's a whole history to be told about not just a set of terms that appear sequentially, Hispanic, Chicano, Latina, Latino, Latinx, and the way these terms racialize people of Mexican descent differently, and the way they also have different meanings for other Latinx people with origins elsewhere. But also about how each of these terms efface other kinds of cultural difference by reductively racializing them. Erasing, for instance, the fact that a huge portion of recent immigrants coming to the US-Mexican border are indigenous people, many of whom don't speak Spanish at all or speak it as a second language. Or that there are racial divisions within people's country of origin. A Cuban immigrant who is unquestionably white in Cuba may be racialized very differently in the US, and someone with very dark skin from Puerto Rico can arrive in the mainland US and be treated first of all as if they come from a foreign country rather than part of the US, and then as either black for visual reasons or Hispanic or Latinx because of their language. Right? Racialization can go in a whole number of different directions for different people. There's also a history to be told about immigrants from Asia being racialized in different ways at different times. Right? Japanese and Chinese have switched roles historically, depending on which country is at that time seen as an enemy to the US, but are then racialized together with people from other Asian regions, whom they might have seen as wholly racially different when in Asia, but maybe not with Filipinos, who might be racialized as Asian American or treated as Latinx, due to the cultural effects of the colonization of the Philippines by Spain. These are really, really sort of quick and dirty kinds of examples, and they all need a lot of nuance, but the point is how varied racialization processes can be. I'm barely scratching the surface, and I'm not claiming expertise in anything other than that 19th century history I touched on. LeBennett, who, by the way, I used to teach at Fordham in the African and African American Studies Department, LeBennett and Hosang are, I hope, quite clear in their presentation. Though, of course, I'll take questions about their piece too. But I just want to emphasize one point they make, which is how the term racialization can help us see race not only as not at all as a stable identity, not as a fixed real thing, but as a process. This is in one of your questions. It's a process that is not only imposed from outside. A group can racialize itself and may have good reason for doing so. Just as one example, the growth of the racial category Asian American has its origins not in whites imposing that identity, though whites have certainly glommed together different Asian identities in callous ways for many years, but rather the term Asian American grew primarily from activists and writers who were promoting connections between groups that hadn't seen their identity or their situation as shared. So, people can racialize themselves in this sense. So racialization is closely linked to racial formation, which is in the title of that book by Omi and Wynant that is a recommended reading, and that Hosang and LeBennett cite quite a bit. There's something to be learned from this term, racial formation, and its emphasis on process more than identity. We might experiment with phrases like gender formation or sexual formation to emphasize the way these are also processes as much or more than they are stable identities. But if we do so, it would be important to emphasize that they may be very different processes. Gender, race, sexuality, class, and other identities may be all constructed. But constructing an identity on the foundation of the fiction of race is importantly different from constructing one on any of those other foundations. So we need to see some connections, but also some differences. I'm going to stop there for now. Hope this was helpful, and that it will make our online discussion and synchronous discussions on Friday more productive. See you then.